Okay, our third session is on trade and investment. I'd like to invite the chair of this session, Bozkurt Aran from TEPAV, and our lead speakers today is Richard Baldwin from CEPR, Gary Hofbauser from Peterson, Yoduk Kang from KIEP, and Sinan Ülgen from EDAM. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Aran.
Thank you so much. I think this meeting should be interesting because the trade is the subject that we all feel quite close to. And secondly, of course, the handicapped because of the luncheon. Now we have just had the lunch, and the time has come to have coffee, and there is siesta, most probably. But let me say a few things before I start. Then, of course, we have a very eminent panel waiting to make their presentations. And there is a slight change in the program. Instead of Sinan Ülgen, of course, Professor Mehmet Arda from the Galatasaray University, and also he is the former director of the UNCTAD, is here. And we are very happy that he's in the panel. When I talked with our panelists yesterday, I told them that what should I be saying? And the answer was simple. He said, you ambassadors are fun, could tell jokes, and that will be enough. Just tell a joke and let the rest to us. This was the joke part of it. Now I'm going to get to the serious part. I try to set the stage, I should say. Dramatic things are happening in the global trade area. It really is dramatic. There are conflicting signs. There are signs that are not that cannot be quite easily interpreted. We have to look quite closely. Number one, trade, the development or the growth in trade is well below the global development or growth. So trade and the economic development are not going hand in hand. Prior to almost in 3 decades, trade always preceded economic growth by at least twice. One, if grew by 3%, trade grew by 7%. Now the vice versa is happening. 3.3% in the economic growth, whereas the trade growth is around 3.1%. So why it is so? And this is a question that we need to answer. Of course, one would say that there is the protectionism is on the rise, which is not the case. Protectionism is not on the rise. It is under control. There is protectionism, there is no question. And protectionism should be in our agenda, but protectionism is not the culprit for this lowering of the trade. Is it structural? Or are the countries turning inwards? Are they trying to, contrary to the value chain, are they trying to produce the parts within the country? And it remains to be seen. So we have to keep this in mind, but this is another question that we should be open and keeping in mind. Though, of course, the trade is slowing down, growth is a bit higher, then we are not confronted with a trade war. That is definite, even though the 2008 crisis has not totally been out, and we are still in the woods. We are not out of the woods yet, but still the protectionist movements, the race to top is not taking place. So maybe is it because of the G20? And during the time of the crisis, G20 summit had twice meetings in 2008, 2009, instead of once a year. Twice a year the meetings took place. So could the G20 have a contribution? I don't know. It's up to you. We have to discuss these things. But maybe in G20, when the trade ministers come together, when the summit, the presidents, the prime ministers come together, they create something like a peer pressure, peer review, as was mentioned before. So this could be one of the reasons why we have not seen a trade war. Then we are quite pessimistic about the WTO. We say the WTO is not functioning. WTO is a defunct or a dead organization, or just about to put the last nails on the coffin. Is it so? Well, WTO produces legally binding documents. Now I have to defend, as I was the ambassador there for 4.5 years, I have to defend my colleagues. No, it is not the case. I mean, the negotiators are good negotiators. They know what to negotiate, and they have made quite substantial progress in the trade. But why? Then we claim the shortcoming in the trade area, the liberalization, let's say, is not going forward, and we claim the WTO. It is the countries, it is the major stakeholders do not move forward. They stop. It is not the fora, it is not the negotiating ground at fault for that, for that matter. It's not like UNCTAD, WTO. I mean, it's a member-led organization. If the members do not want to push a subject forward, nothing moves. And if a major stakeholder, a major country, by major countries, let me spell out, China, Brazil, EU, United States, and India. Those are the major stakeholders. If one of these five decide not to move, stops. The same thing will happen in G20 or other forums. It doesn't matter where you see this thing coming. Then we see another new approach, and that is the multilateralism on one side. It doesn't move. The WTO has not produced any liberalization on the multilateral front for about 2 decades, 2.5 decades. 3 decades, in fact, but the 14 years since Doha round was declared, nothing came forward. Not really nothing came forward. Of course, trade, we will say trade facilitation, but trade facilitation is a small bolt in the whole machine. I mean, the others, the market access issues are more important. Services, trade, and NAMA, industrial goods, and agriculture. We don't see a significant move on that. So if it is not moving, and certain countries want to move forward, they want to create a liberalization. So then, is it the reason why we see this mega regional agreements coming forward? And would it change the scene at the end? And would it create a conducive ground for the WTO or for the rest of the multilateral system to further liberalize? Or would it create two different worlds? Those are the questions that I have in mind, and those are the questions that some of our panel members will address, but they will have 10 minutes each. If you want to say less, of course, you are entitled to say so. But at the end, we need to have a lively discussion. And interaction among the audience is a must. Otherwise, I'll come and I'll sing here. Thank you. Now, I'll call on Richard to make his presentation. Please.
Well, let me start, like everybody else, thanking the organizers for an opportunity to share my thoughts with this impressive audience in this impressive space. I was trying to figure out how to combine the idea that we're in a library of paper knowledge. We are a library of human knowledge. I didn't quite work it out, but I think there's something there. What I'd like to do today is make 3 points, and then I'd like to talk about what those points mean for what we're supposed to be doing here today. The 3 points are, first of all, that the nature of trade has changed. The second point is that the nature of trade disciplines has changed. And the third point is the WTO has not changed. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about how these 3 points help us understand why the world trading system is in such a mess. And then to talk a little bit about why the T20 could potentially do something about it. Let me take my points a little bit one by one. You said I had an hour and a half, was that?
45 minutes.
Okay, 45 minutes, all right, good. So let me start with the changed nature of international commerce. Now, I like to think about traditional trade as 20th century trade, basically goods crossing borders. That is what we've all conceptualized international trade as being. It's what we were taught, it's what we think about. It's what the WTO is mostly about. But since the ICT revolution, it's been possible to organize complex activities over distance, and that has led to an international fragmentation of production. To put it simply, now international commerce is not just goods crossing borders, it's factories crossing borders. And that changes everything. In particular, with factories crossing borders, the types of international flows that must be underpinned by the disciplines of an international agreement or organization are far more complex. Think about it like this. Think about the flows of goods, knowledge, information, trading, know-how that take place within a factory in Germany in 1980. Now that factory is split across borders, and those flows that used to happen inside rich country factories are now part of international commerce. Moreover, those flows cannot be separated. There's a nexus of trade in goods, services, intellectual property rights, capital, and key personnel that must cross borders to keep the factory running. Now, this brings to the second point, which is the nature of disciplines necessary to facilitate trade have changed and become radically more complex than they used to be. With 20th century trade, goods crossing borders, basically you needed very few rules to make sure that things didn't mess up, that there was not some sort of opportunistic behavior, and you had to get down tariffs. That's what trade agreement was about, that's what the GATT was about. It was a relatively simple thing. In 21st century trade, where factories are crossing borders, you need a whole set of assurances that you did not need before. For one thing, you need assurances that this supply chain will keep going. The goods have to arrive, the services have to arrive, capital has to be able to move, the know-how has to be able to move, and key personnel have to be able to move across borders. These must be assured, or you will not make the investment abroad. These have to be bundled together in some sort of package, and that brings me to my third point. The WTO was not open for business when it comes to these 21st century disciplines. As we heard, the WTO set up an agenda for itself in 2001, which was based on the leftovers of an agenda set in 1986. The world has changed since 2001, but the WTO is still focused on this old agenda. This change in trade opened up enormous opportunities. Just to say things in a very stylized way, it allowed high technology to go to low wages and make stuff. And that changed everything. That changed industrialization policies, and it changed competitiveness policies for rich countries. The countries who wanted the factories, the South, were willing to commit to all sorts of reforms that have nothing to do with trade. You look at some of the deep agreements between the United States and Latin American countries, or Japan and Southeast Asian countries, or things they're talking about in TTIP. Those seem to have nothing to do with trade, 21st century trade, But there are things that developing countries are falling over themselves to commit to on intellectual property rights, capital movements, labor, environment, all sorts of things, because they want the factories. And the countries sending the factories want their companies and intellectual property rights to be protected, and that kind of offshoring now is essential to their own competitiveness. With Japan offshoring to East Asia and Germany offshoring to Central Europe, the US has to do it or they won't be competitive. So we have a large demandeur for new disciplines and a large supply for new disciplines, and the natural place to do this, the WTO, was not open for business. So it went into the deep regional trade agreements, deep meaning beyond tariffs. And now, as the logic of global value chains gets more complex, it's evolved into mega-regionalisms, mega-regional, in particular TPP, which is in some sense knitting some of these things together. So that's my 3 points, and I think it helps explain the mess we're in. So what can the T20 or anybody really do about this? I hope and I believe that some of these 21st century disciplines will be multilateralized. It's not the best form of governance when a handful of countries are setting the rules for these things. They should be brought up to the multilateral level, probably in the WTO. But how? Which ones? How are we going to adopt the WTO principles of things like special and differential treatment to the disciplines that are now being weaved into the TPP, for example? This, I think, requires a great deal of discussion and research, and I think the T20 would be a great place to do this. And I believe we have time, because I don't think the WTO will be ready until the end of this decade to move on to these issues. And in the meantime, we should start thinking about what it would look like if some of these were in the WTO. Just a couple issues, for example. How much would we actually have to change on investment, for example? We have 3,000 bilateral investment treaties that aren't really that different. But who has done the research to say what is the least common denominator we already have? How difficult would it be just to codify that into the WTO? Same thing on intellectual property rights. It's more complicated on other things, but that kind of discussion and research has not been done. I think the T20 would be an excellent place to do it, because otherwise it'll be done by the OECD or the World Bank or UNCTAD, each with their own agenda. It's a uniquely, we probably need some more least developed countries around the table, but you can fix that up. Now, it's a very long-haul effort, and in particular, another issue which I really think we have to worry about is, what does special and differential treatment look like? So far, all these disciplines have been in bilateral regional trade agreements directed by one northern country. And the conditions of the reform have been essentially imposed on the southern country. It's take it or leave it. You take the NAFTA model, et cetera. Special and differential treatment really is not cooked in there. But it cannot go into the WTO unless there's some special differential treatment. But what does it mean to have special and differential treatment in these 21st century disciplines? Now, I understand very much that this is a long-haul effort, figuring out how to multilateralize 21st century regionalisms, which aspects we should do, how to do it. But I think that the T20, as we've heard a little bit this morning and both at the breakfast and now, perhaps the T20 is a place to keep a longer vision, a slower burn thing, to do something important rather than just finding a quick fix for this year's communiqué. I truly believe that policy influence is not an event, it's a process. And you need an institutional underpinning to keep a multi-year process of a complex issue like this going. I've taken great inspiration from where the OECD's study of agricultural protectionism over years and years, steadily analyzing, gathering data, eventually influenced the world at how it did. And my hope is that the T20 could do that. So that's a little over 10 minutes, but I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Do I have to announce? We have now the guru of the trade. We have one, and I'm going to have the next one. Please.
Thank you, thank you. Well, like Richard, I want to thank the host for this splendid setting and a distinguished audience that has been brought together. And then I want to note that Andreas Rosenthal chided us this morning for talking about issues that don't really matter outside of this room. And so I plead guilty for myself, for Richard Baldwin, and for the other panelists, because we're talking about something, the WTO, which does not matter probably to very many people outside this room. And it's even worse than that. It doesn't matter very much to business leaders today, because it has fallen so far, so fast. But in this room, there are some of us who are older than others, and I'll include Andreas in that, who remember the tremendous contribution that the GATT, prior to the WTO, made to world growth for 50 years after the Second World War. And the evidence, I think, is overwhelming. It contributed to the best half-century, contributed enormously to the best half-century in world history, and that's per Angus Madison's figures. So, in the spirit of trying to resuscitate an institution and building on what Richard Baldwin has just said, I want to offer a grand bargain to try to fire up the WTO. It's a shorter-term bargain than what Richard talked about. It has three parts. Part A is that the advanced members of the WTO, which is basically the OECD countries and a few others, should agree to settle the outstanding Doha round issues on agriculture, non-agricultural market access, and DFQF, duty-free, quota-free, on terms acceptable to emerging country and least developed country members, which are numerically the majority of members. That's a big concession. That's part A. Part B is that in return, emerging country and LDC members should agree that, and now this gets a little bit complicated, but it's all in my one-pager, which some people have and others don't, with the consent of two-thirds majority of WTO members, a double-weighted two-thirds, so two-thirds of the members and two-thirds of the trade. Any plurilateral agreement can be added to the Marrakesh Agreement. And now I'm digging deep into the legal weeds, but this would require an amendment to Article Roman numeral 10, subparagraph 10 of the agreement, which speaks of consensus being required to add a plurilateral agreement to the Marrakesh Agreement. And I'm going to come back to that word consensus in a moment. If a plurilateral agreement in turn required a waiver of other WTO obligations, and in particular the unconditional most favored nation obligation, replace that with a conditional most favored nation, then in turn that waiver could be adopted by the same double-weighted majority of WTO members. Currently, that waiver requires 3/4, not double-weighted, but 3/4 numerically of WTO members. So that would require another amendment to the agreement, and that's Article Roman 9, paragraph 3. So that would be the deal, that the developing countries, emerging countries, least developed countries would get what they wanted out of the Doha package. All countries would get this ability to forge new plurilateral agreements with a double-weighted majority of consent of the WTO members. And that would open the door for dealing with all the new issues that Richard Baldwin puts under the umbrella of 21st century trade. And I could go through a list of those, but I won't because time precludes. The third part of my grand bargain is somewhat independent of the first two parts, but it's that the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, which has been its crown jewel, should be open to bilateral and regional trade agreements that wish to use it. And if you follow this part of juridical lore, you would know that most free trade agreements do not have functioning dispute settlement portions in them, and that really weakens their value, because if you don't have a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, then you're back to diplomatic solutions, and those typically work slowly, if at all. So I would like to see the WTO be willing to offer its very able services. The regional agreements and bilateral agreements would have to pay, obviously, and there have to be an expansion. But it would then cement the role of the WTO, which is already very strong, but cement it further as the place where commercial disputes in the world trade and investment system are settled. Now, just a small explanation of these propositions. The consensus rule has now been codified since the WTO agreement to mean that no one member can object. In other words, if one member objects, you don't have consensus. Now, this is ridiculous. There is no parliamentary body which works that way. There is no judicial system which works on that kind of unanimity. And we saw how ridiculous that was when India stood up and for a while blocked the trade facilitation agreement. So we have to get rid of the consensus rule. And I'm proposing to get rid of it for plurilateral pacts, as I mentioned. It's long since past the time when the GATT was a one-size-fits-all. It has all sorts of tiers of variations. This notion that it's the Holy Roman Church is just ludicrous. It's just not the case. I mean, what has happened over the years is that there are all sorts of distinctions between members, and I'm just suggesting we follow that path further in search of organization which can make forward progress. I've already talked about the WTO being having this very strong and very successful dispute settlement mechanism, and I think it would be just so much better for the world system if that was the central place. And also, you know, it's expensive intellectually, it's expensive monetarily to set up a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, and it would be very convenient for a lot of countries which wanted to avail themselves of this service. That also would require an amendment, but not maybe such a earth-shattering one. Thank you very much.
This is my pleasure to be here, and I express my sincere gratitude to TAPAP to invite me and my colleague to here. Actually, let me start with my personal observation. I have been working at my institute, Kiev, since 2009, and 2010, Korea took a presidency of G20. So in Kiev, we organized the G20 support group, which involved roughly 20 researchers since 2009. And I wasn't involved, but I was a close observer for that support group. In 2009, we invited one European professor, and we opened some small scale of seminar on G20 issues. That professor told us very actually he told a very interesting point, saying 2009 is a kind of a honeymoon in G20 between China and US, because the finance crisis is on the way. It's very urgent to cooperate between a major economy on just recovery from the economic turmoil. But he said in 2010, the global economy will be completely different. Actually, most of the economy will be recovery process. When economy is going down, everybody just forgets something marginal and they tend to cooperate. But when recovery process, several domestic issues comes up, and that will be kind of a nightmare for Korea to coordinate that kind of conflictory national interest issue between a G20 member country. I'm not sure the 2015 will be crisis period or normal period. Anyway, as far as I know, there's some divergent interest and issue between G20 members, so that will be a top task for the G20 presidency to coordinate this kind of issues. But I think this is a good opportunity for us to contribute as a think tank to these issues. Well, as you mentioned before by one of the speakers, trade is not the issue that G20 put priority on. I mean, we talk about the finance crisis, sovereign debt crisis, the fiscal crisis, but we don't talk about trade crisis. There is only trade cooperation. So I think this is one of the reasons that the trade issue do not have important place in a G20 agenda, but actually trade concern everybody. We are all consumer and suppliers, so I think trade is one of the important issues which should be discussed in G20, also in 220 agenda. For a few minutes, last few minutes, let me provide some reflection on relationship between multilateralism and regionalism. Actually, it was already discussed by previous speakers. Debates on the relationship between multilateralism and regionalism are summarized with the help of two key questions. The first much debated question is whether preferential trade liberalization with the RTA, Regional Trade Agreement, contribute to strengthening the multilateral trading system as an integral part, or whether it hurts effort to make progress in multilateral trade liberalization. We just divide stepping stone and stumbling stones. Since 1990s, this question has divided economists into two groups, one in favor of RTAs and the other skeptical about RTA. The second and less contested question is how the development of a multilateral trading system influence proliferation of RTA. This question concerns both developed and developing countries and closely related to preference margin of RTA. If multilateral trade liberation brought about satisfactory result to country, it will reduce the desire of country to turn to regionalism. But the delay and impasse in multilateral trade negotiation can give birth to increasing preference to RTA. It's a well-known fact. Keeping in mind the competitive relation between regionalism and multilateralism, it is useful to ask the question about how the development of multilateralism can dissuade countries from inclining to regionalism, and how possibly establishing RTA can be regarded as an alternative option to effort on multilateral trade liberalization. Actually, as multilateral trade liberalization advances, producing more effective and far-reaching results, both the existing and forthcoming preference margin of RTA are supposed to be eroded. This might be true until the late 80s, as the increase in number of RTA was small. But nowadays, the situation is completely different. And every country engaged in negotiating the FTA. Actually, my institute was created in late 1980s to support the Uruguay round negotiation. actually the two objectives, Uruguay round negotiation and also to support the diplomatic relation with the ex-Soviet bloc countries. At that time, our department of WTO was very large. Actually, they provide all strategy for Korean government to negotiate WTO accession and so on. But in late 1990s and early 2000, department of WTO became small. Right nowadays, for the last 5 years, they are far small compared to FTA department. I'm just saying the Korean experience, how much Korea they intend to FTA rather than going to WTO. A simple and immediate answer for this kind of change is that number of parties involved in RTA negotiation is smaller, only 2 in case of bilateral talks. Therefore, it takes less time to reach a decision. This is often why the RTA are more attractive to policymakers and business community who want fast result. And let me add some complementary argument to that factor. Firstly, nowadays FTA is different from the old version of the FTA. Usually, FTA concluded between involving northern country, a developed country, tend to include all issues already discussed in WTO. It cover the trade of service, investment, intellectual property right, and procurement. Public procurement. If multilateral negotiations are delayed or seem to be insufficient to produce an effective negotiation, countries turn to preferential negotiation with like-minded countries. This is what happened till now. And let me say one thing. My second point is that actually it's quite easy to deal with the tariff issue in WTO, but it's very hard to tackle with non-tariff barrier at multilateral level because it concerns the actual regulation. So probably this is why most of countries, including developing countries, turn to FTA to reduce not only a tariff barrier of developed country, also the non-tariff barrier of the developed country. Before concluding, let me put additional point, particularly the observing ongoing mega FTA involving US and European Union. Actually, if such a mega FTA such as TPP and TTIP are implemented, all argument between multilateralism and regionalism will be obsolete. From my point of view, this kind of mega FTA is a kind of a vacuum cleaner in the sense that absorb all issues that should be discussed at WTO level. So in that sense, this mega FTA is a kind of de facto regionalized WTO in the sense that they cover all issues. If mega FTAs are really implemented as today's formula, it is highly imaginable the role of WTO will become kind of a trade settlement agency. So, in my view, it is very important to develop a new agenda that can be only treated at multilateral level. I think on recent emphasis on global value chain can be good point that can be discussed in the multilateral level. We have a lot of FTA, but because of number of FTA, rule of origin become a kind of nightmare. It's quite complicated and it's very hard to harmonize all rule of FTA stated by FTA. But I think at WTO level, it will be possible to provide a kind of a minimal template for rule of origin. And if it will be successful, there can be a kind of starting point to reinvigorate the WTO. My next point is that I said probably the negotiating FTA is simple and it takes less time than WTO. But if we look at the length of negotiation period of individual FTA, actually it's not true. Korea have a FTA both with the European Union and US. Korea-EU FTA took 5 years from start of negotiation to actual implementation. Korea-US FTA, it took 7 years from 2006 to 2012 for implementation. Let me say the EU-India FTA negotiation started from the 2007, but still negotiation is underway. EU-Canada FTA, actually negotiation started from 2009. Negotiation was finalized late last year, but I think it will take another years to be implemented. So actually, FTA takes also a lot of time. So in the meantime, I think we can have a proper opportunity to develop a new agenda to reinvigorate WTO. I think in that sense, T20 and all institutions involved in T20 can provide kind of policy support and idea for that revival. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bosco. That's what you have when you have a friend as the chairman. You get drafted in the last minute, so thanks. Now, a lot has been said, so I'll try not to repeat what has been said. I'll pose a question, actually. What is WTO's task? I mean, WTO seems, at least when I was in UNCTAD, it was the only game in town, actually. So when it is the only game in town, you tend to load all sorts of responsibilities upon the WTO. For instance, everything from dealing with labor issues to environment, to taking care of the environment, to taking even care of the currency undervaluation or overvaluation was considered to be a task at WTO. So that is a question that I have in mind, and I personally don't think that the WTO should be given more and more responsibilities that it is not really formulated to deal with, and I think that was one of the things which was sort of implied in a way. So WTO is extremely important, but we have to know what it is there for, and we should not load upon it things that we should not be unjust and load upon it things that it doesn't really do. So that's one of the first things that I have to mention. It's there in order to make trade work on a rules-based basis. I think that's what my WTO colleagues used to say, a rules-based trading system. I think that's the main thing. Now, that being said, another question I have in mind is, where are we there to liberalize trade, facilitate trade? Yes, we should facilitate trade, but what is trade for, and what is the purpose of trade? You know, in theory, we say trade enriches countries, okay? But who is the country? I mean, it's good for every country that participates in trade. But who is the country? And then we go, in theory, giving courses internationally. Then we say the winners can compensate the losers. I haven't seen a winner to compensate any loser up to now. So that is one of the other issues that one has to take in mind now. What is the purpose? Why are we facilitating trade? I mean, it increases the welfare, it increases the GNP of the world. But how that is distributed among everybody, I think, is a crucial thing, which should not be really brushed aside. And that depends on what type of system that we have. And it is not only international trading system. Of course, it has a lot, and it has probably more with the domestic, what goes on in each country. And but I think that's an integral part of the question that we have to deal with when we're talking about trade, and I think trade and development is the title, whatever the issue is. At least it is for me, regardless of what the title of the session is. And there, there also are some issues that we have to keep in mind. Trade is basically a rules-based trade. Of course, rules-based trade, but it all starts, a lot of things depend where you start from, okay? So that is also something which one has to take into account. Trade creates lots of opportunities that I'll talk about in a minute. But it also tends to set a path-dependent, it may set a path-dependent course. And I think the important thing is how to, for at least developing countries, or even the developed countries, I think, how to get out of that path dependence and how to improve what you're doing, how to go into a better resource allocation. And trade does not, in theory it does, but I don't think trade leads to an optimal resource allocation. So that requires a lot of domestic measures as well. And the international trading system has to allow for that to take place. One of the issues is the SMEs, which is also something which G20 talks about a lot. I think it's crucially important. And SMEs is not a developing country. The SMEs in developed countries, especially in agriculture, for instance, in agriculture, lots of big enterprises as well, but the small enterprises in developed countries as well are facing the same problems, the same type of constraints, the same types of hurdles that the developing country SMEs are facing when they have to participate in global value chains. Again, that's something I'll mention in a few minutes, in a little bit. So this is these are some of the things I think we have to keep in mind when talking about what type of system that we want. Okay, the system should be able, should facilitate countries to change course to get on a more on a path which leads to one better allocation of benefits within the country, and secondly, that benefits that leads to a faster growth for everybody. So one of the important things I think again is we talk about market access a lot. But market access is one thing, market entry is another thing, which we have to really keep in mind. Market access is a legal issue. Okay, market access can be facilitated, market access can be perfect. But market entry, there are a lot of market entry barriers which have to be taken into account in trade. Okay? For a lot of firms, the market entry barriers are much, much more important than market access barriers. One of the important things is a market access barrier. Those barriers are subject to WTO discipline, for instance. You can have to, you can challenge market access barriers at the WTO. But market entry barriers, which may be based on market structures or private standards, whatever, those cannot really be challenged anywhere. And those are what really make trade very difficult for a lot of firms that are entering into trade. By the way, of course, it is firms that trade. It's not countries that trade. So not only do we have to think about who gains, but also we think that who are the actors who actually trade. Huh? So those are the firms, and and from what I have heard, what I have seen, it is the market entry barriers which are more important, which cannot be challenged in the WTO. Those are the barriers. Those are the standards that are set by supermarkets, for instance, or that are set by international electronics firm, whatever. So those standards are the really key things that have to be firms have to deal with in order to trade. And by the way, I mean, it's, these global value chains that we're talking about, whether you're selling bananas in the supermarket or whether you're selling highly sophisticated electronic material, they're all nowadays part of the global value chains. So, I mean, I think these are some of the issues that I think we have to mention. I don't have the answers, but these are the types of things that the G20 have to take into account, and we as T20 have to put on the agenda of the work. Now, so about the regionals, a few words about the mega regionals. They're usually WTO plus things, but their WTO compatibility, I don't think is really have been challenged or have been, I mean, there's a body whose name I forgot now within the WTO that is supposed to verify whether these, all these regional arrangements are WTO compatible. And I don't think it has met in ages, or maybe it has met, I don't know, but we don't really see anything. But that was, for instance, that body was very important when the European common market was being established. They looked at it, as far as I know. But now we don't hear anything about the work of that. In a couple of minutes, another thing is this, on this global value chain participation. I think the type of aid for trade, or the type of aid for international or domestic, has to aim at facilitating firms' participation in these global value chains. It always depends where and how you participate in these chains, how much of the aggregate value added of the chain accrues to you. So in order, that's of course very, it's a very simple truth. But how to improve the ability of the developing country firms and other SMEs, basically, in developed countries as well, to improve their capacity to either produce things which are not completely standardized or homogeneous, but with some specificity, and have some ideas about how to improve. That should be one of the important things of aid for trade and development policies. And I think the G20 should make a point of pointing that out in the that the development aid should be reoriented towards that in order to assist in generating benefits from trade. Another thing, of course, is how to share, how the shares or how the benefits of trade are shared domestically. And there, in UNCTAD, I was head of the commodities, so I looked at this a lot. For instance, for natural resource producing countries, how the whole issue of how the rents are distributed, how the rents are determined, how much fish is being fished in the areas. I mean, those are all important governance issues, domestic and international, which have a big impact on the sharing of the benefits of trade. And one last thing, perhaps, the diversification into higher productivity areas in developing countries is basically is a good thing for everybody, but it is a very risky issue. The firms find it very difficult to enter into new areas, especially in developing countries that have the small firms. So some sort of help to these countries, some sort of risk sharing by these firms is basically, in my mind, a way of producing a global public good. And this should be also part of the G20 approach to it. How to facilitate the diversification into higher productivity and higher yielding areas in developing countries and also other places as well even. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think we had a very nice and very stimulating, I should say, panel. And maybe I should follow what Malcolm has done. I'll just highlight a few things that our panelists have put forward and ask you to respond. Richard Baldwin was a magnificent, of course, very impressive and edifying. You said the trade has changed. Trade has changed totally, but the WTO answers the trade of 20th century. We come to the 21st century, and they become voiceless. I mean, they do not put forward much important legislation or resolutions. And of course, then the investment has become a major part of the trade. It has become as important as it, and the value change. And one of the things that he said that impressed me quite a lot is that the whole trade issues are a process. WTO is a process, not an event. I mean, eventually, it simmers, and like a good food, it takes time to cook. And maybe, would you like to respond to any? Of course, I do not intend to. This is to capture what he has said. Said much more, but this is what I thought in mind. Then, please, 1, 2, 3, and okay, this is it. I won't be singing. We go 1, 3, and they 1, 3. Yeah, okay. Should I maybe let's do it like this. And then now we have so much. Then maybe I should also summarize what the others have said, and then open for floor. And then as for the, so I will not be doing what Malcolm has done. Then the whole part is that, I mean, has mentioned a method to flare up the WTO, and in 3 steps. Advanced economies gives concessions, egg, NAMA, DFQF, and this will be accepted by the emerging economies. Emerging economies, in return, would get their consensus and would be willing to be part of the plurilateral if they wish to. But then, in the meantime, there is the double weighted 2/3 majority, and that will be the first 21st century trade, and the dispute settlement would be enlarged to the ones who are willing. Our Korean colleague, Ya Yang-dong, has said the 2008, the US-China honeymoon started, but then the marriage was not consumed, I suppose. And there's a strong, these days, tension among those 2 countries. Multilateralism and regionalism, non-tariff measures was quite important. And he says patience is, of course, this is coming from Southeast Asia. It is quite important. The patience is the issue, and we need to be more patient. It took so many years for the Korea and the other countries to achieve their FTAs. And Mehmet mentioned the WTO has more responsibility than necessary, so we should not be dealing too much. I mean, there should be more prudent when we come to deal with the WTO matters, and the benefit domestically, how could this be done, and the regionals should, how the regions could be compatible with the WTO. So then we start with the gentleman, that he was the first one to raise his hand, and then of course we'll have a discussion. So if the questions could be limited to 2 or 3 minutes, then we can continue. With that, please.
I'll be much quicker. Matt Goodman, just for Gary Huffbauer, just to understand your proposal, is your idea that this would be a path to getting to a multilateral system again, or is this sort of out of resignation that we're not in that world anymore, and therefore we should just be practical and try to get these plurilateral deals locked in? Or is it to incentivize people to join and then ultimately get to a multilateral deal? And the second question is, would India take that deal?
Yeah. Shall we wait and see? Please. Please.
Thank you. Igor Makarov, the High School of Economics. I'd like to point out very shortly 3 questions, 3 issues that can be addressed, in my opinion, by G20 with regard to international trade. The first one is preferential trade agreements, but I completely agree with those who say that the issues of coordination between preferential trade agreements and multilateral trade system should be discussed within the WTO, but the question is much broader, because TPP and TTIP, they provide some negative externalities to world economy and to non-member states, and they lead to redistribution on trade flows, and this is a large challenge for world economy. And this is, in this sense, this is a macroeconomic problem, not even the trade problem itself. So in this sense, this challenge should be addressed by G20, in my opinion. The second one is trade climate nexus. As far as G20 declares climate change as one of the major challenges it should address, and as far as G20 countries represent together, taking together 80% of global emissions, I think this is G20 who should address this challenge. The problem is that 30% of global emissions are released within the production of internationally traded goods, and the fact that within international climate agreements, only the emissions which are released within the production on the territory of a state are accounted, this leads to the situation that Annex 1 countries of Kyoto Protocol and they substitute the emissions by importing carbon-intensive goods from abroad, and this leads to the carbon leakage, and this is a large problem, and so certainly G20 may address this. And the third one is economic sanctions. I'm sure that certainly conditions of imposing sanctions or taking it away should not be discussed within G20. It is too political question. But however, some technical questions should be discussed within G20 as well. Such questions as clarifying the reason of national security, which is used by imposing sanctions, and it can be discussed within WTO. Sorry.
Thank you. There was one other lady over here, and then.
Okay.
Then before we pass on to the side, I suppose the panelists.
Yeah.
You have, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Yes.
Please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Veronica Grondona from Cefidar in Argentina. And I wanted to make one comment in relation to trade agreement, to specifically, investment agreement, bilateral investment agreements. It's not so clear that they have benefited the investment flows of the countries who have signed it. Actually, there's a very unequal relationship generally in relation to bilateral investment treaties between developed countries and developing countries, particularly because developed countries are the ones producing the investment, something that has been said, and interested in the secureness of that investment. And developing countries are the ones receiving such investment normally with no chances of questioning any of the manners in which it's done. So I think that should be taken care of, and if we move into any multilateral treatments in that respect, they could be damaging for developing countries. So a reform should be considered, which considers the possibilities of countries developing their own, having their own macroeconomic policies and being allowed to have macroeconomic policies and not being punished when attempting to do that in the context of bilateral investment treaties.
Thank you. Andreas, you have.
Thank you. I happen to agree with the Argentine colleague, with Veronica, because I think she's made a point that I made for many years when the developed country governments would come and say, you need to sign an investment protection agreement in order to attract investment. We didn't sign very many of them, and we managed to attract investment in any case. But I want to get back to the trade agenda, and I want to tell Gary, who I very deeply respect, because he knows a lot about the subject.
Yes, of course.
That the fact is that if he goes back, we wrote a paper for this meeting, Barry, Karen, and I, And we said three things which we thought were very important. One is lead, follow, or get out of the way. And the other was when you come to a roadblock, take a detour. And what happened at the WTO is that there came a roadblock, and those who wanted to lead went and led and let the others stay back and take whatever they could out of what they were going to do. And that's what happened with NAFTA, and that's what happened later on with the other plurilateral and multilateral, regional, sub-regional, mega, whatever you want to call them, trade deals. It's what's happening today with TTP. Maybe it'll happen with TTIP, I don't know. But in any case, TTP will be finalized by June, and we will have the world's largest plurilateral trade agreement.
Yeah. Would the panelists respond? Gary, would you like to? You have your name is mentioned.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So many questions, so little time. So let me start with Matt. The word multilateral has various meanings. And certainly, if it's conducted within the WTO, that means in principle, any country could join a plurilateral agreement if it so thought it was in its interest. And we've had a couple of mentioned in subsequent comments, one on emissions. I can see an emissions agreement which China, the US, maybe a few other countries could sign on to. I think a lot of countries wouldn't want to sign on to it. I can see a state-owned enterprise agreement, which a handful of countries. I can see an investment agreement, despite what Andreas and the Argentinian spokesperson have said, which many countries would find very agreeable because they wanted to attract investment. It would be open. In that sense, it would be multilateral, but they wouldn't be obliged to join it. So that's what I'm seeing. And I would see that if you had these plurilateral agreements over time, as countries saw that it was beneficial to them, they'd make their own decisions. They want to stay out, make their own decisions, they would come in and it would gradually enlarge. And that was what happened after the Tokyo round. And I think that same evolution would happen, but it'd be over a fairly long period of time. So that's my vision. Let me leave to my colleagues on the panel to answer all the difficult questions. Shall we start with
India?
Oh, India. Yeah, I think, if India, well, let me just say, if you get an India or, it could be Brazil, even though Acevedo hopefully can pull along the Brazilian government. If they block the kind of path I've outlined, well, you can forget the WTO. You can just forget it.
Yeah.
It's basically, it will be TPP, it will be TTIP. Maybe those will enlarge over time, so let's take TTIP particularly. I think eventually, if it comes into being, it will bring in Turkey, right here, and it will bring in Canada and Mexico, and maybe a few other countries, and TPP likewise will bring in Korea. I spent a lot of time in China. I think China will eventually, if TPP comes into being, will eventually forge a link with TPP, and the WTO will have its dispute settlement mechanism for the existing rules and will be a very comfortable place for ambassadors to go who had good service for other reasons and don't have much to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to just make a couple points on this deal that Gary proposed. It was my understanding that a lot of the consensus support and the notion against voting comes from countries like the United States who don't want to be outvoted. And I know from historical that the GATT had the consensus rule so that neither the UK nor the US could be outvoted. So I wonder if the US would be all for a sort of voting mechanism where somebody would change the rules of the WTO, which would then be binding on the United States, with them not having a veto. It seems to me that when you go to voting like this in this kind of organization, you're going to need some sort of security council to make sure that none of the big boys, and then we're in a different world. But I'm generally an optimist, and that sounds like a good deal. We definitely should try something to move beyond.
let me amplify another point that Gary made and is speaking to some of the things that were said. So I think we can see a couple different scenarios for the world trade governance. And if I were a betting man, the most likely would that we would go to a 3-pillar trade governance system, of which the WTO will just be one. So right now, the WTO, despite everything we've heard, is working really well. Countries are making major sacrifices to join this organization. Yeah. Even Russia, for example, major sacrifices. China. So the point is it works well for 20th century trade. It is the rules of the road. The dispute settlement is useful to people. It does discipline the big guys like the United States and the EU and Japan from taking unilateral actions. So people want to join this, but it's not addressing the 21st century trade. So it's quite likely that the WTO will stay behind taking care of 20th century trade. The mega regionals will write the rules for 21st century trade, and countries will either live with it or pretend it doesn't ignore for a while. And then we have the pillar that already exists, which is bilateral investment treaties. So that has its own court, it has its own jurisprudence, it works very well, not for everybody, but it works in some sense of an international organization. So perhaps we'll go to that, the WTO will just sort of coast along. The other thing I wanted to talk about, the Argentinian point about the bits being asymmetric, but you could make that even more strongly about deep bilaterals in general, like say US-Colombia was deeply unfair. But it's a funny thing that we've got the world now that the countries who are blocking progress in the WTO, remember, one of the things about the WTO and the GATT is it dilutes the power of the big guys. They at least have to talk to each other. But when you negotiate a deep bilateral agreement with the United States or EU or Japan, it's basically take it or leave it. There's a NAFTA model, which if you want to sign it, fine. Otherwise, go somewhere else. So the bilateral is the most power asymmetric way to propagate the 21st century rules. So if you're worried about power asymmetries and fairness, make sure it gets into the WTO. But many of the countries who are making this point are blocking enlargement of the WTO issue because they want to rebalance the WTO before they go on. I don't think I had anything else particular to say. So,
Mehmet, anything? Doc, you don't?
Not on these issues, but just 1 minute. The point was there was mentioned that 30% of emissions was made on international traded goods. I don't think it matters whether it is produced on international traded goods or domestically used goods, as long as those goods are produced. I don't think it makes any difference, unless one can say that in the places where they are produced, there is more emissions, and I don't think it has been shown that that is the case. So I don't see a big link between where things are produced and the total emissions. Thank you.
Mr. Gong, would you like to add anything?
Well, just one short personal comment. I think even though TPP will be finalized next year, I'm not sure it will be implemented pretty soon because the domestic procedure it takes a long time and it involves more than 10 countries. So implementation will be still complicated.
Absolutely. Well, then questions on this side. We start with the gentleman. Second one, third one, fourth one. I've seen more hands now. Yeah, the last one here.
Well, thank you. Renato Baumann from IP in Brazil. We have been dealing with trade, low growth of trade, WTO, and something. And we as think tanks cannot afford to forget that on the 21st century type of trade, there is a non-trade barrier that in some cases is binding. We haven't opened up our current account, capital account, sorry, and exchange rates do matter. You can say that you cannot overload WTO with the dealing with exchange rate, but we cannot forget that exchange rates, bilateral exchange rates, can be binding, even at regional FTA agreements. That's one thing. The other thing I'd like to share with you it has to do with global value chains. Some countries just don't belong to global value chains. My country, as I say, participates, but from the back door. We just provide raw material and so on. And what we are doing back in IPEA, we are coordinating a group of agencies. We are building up the South American input-output matrix so as to be able to say something more this in terms of potential productive complementarities. I thought you would like to know about a little bit about that.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front.
Harun Öztürkler from Center for Middle Eastern Strategic Studies based in Ankara. I have 3 questions, quick questions. One for the chair. Mr. Chair stated that trade growth has been slower than the GDP growth overall. If that is the case, then the openness, degree of openness measured by the trade volume divided by GDP must have declined. I am not sure if this has been the case or it is supported by data. If you can provide support in terms of data, I will be very happy. The second question is to first speaker. I am sorry, Richard. But I don't remember. Richard, okay. He said that the nature of international trade has changed in the way that not the goods crossing the border anymore, but the factories. If that is the case, then we should have observed a convergence in terms of productivity. And as a result, we should have observed convergence in terms of per capita income. We know that it has not been the case. How can he explain? And the third one is for Mehmet Hoca. He said rightly that for the firms to acquire more share from the value added created, they must diversify their production process. But that's a risky business, so that they need aid. Would he suggest an international bank specifically built to provide risk capital for the SMEs, specifically for those firms in developing countries? Thank you. I appreciate.
Then.
Question for Richard Baldwin, which is actually related to the previous one. In your model, it sounds to me like you still get factor price equalization in the long run, but there are fewer untraded factors than there used to be. I guess the question I have is whether the implication of, there's a lot of concern in developed countries, particularly in the United States, about the splitting apart of the income distribution between the median income and the lower income. And I guess my question is, does the movement of the BRICS countries into international trade over the last 20 years, is that then, in your view, a major factor or even the major factor for the splitting apart of the income distribution in the developed countries? Because unskilled labor eventually is going to be paid the same dollar wage everywhere.
Said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Said Akman from TEPAV. 3 points I would like to raise for G20 agenda for trade. First, the inclusiveness. This concept is quite essential. I think Professor Arda mentioned about the SMEs. How small firms should be more relevant to trade agenda. That one aspect G20 should consider seriously. The second point is implementation. So how to implement the easy things? We should start with the easy things. I think trade facilitation is the next step for G20 agenda to pick up the low-hanging fruits. And I think the third issue is the most challenging one. As you see, most of the challenges to the multilateral system comes from trade policy rulemaking. Because I think the regional agreements are also relevant to rulemaking. Who puts the rules and what kind of rules we need? And I think in that respect, we expect whoever puts the rules should be WTO compatible or not. But we should also think otherwise, how to make the WTO more compatible to the trade policy needs of firms, as Professor Baldwin put it, how to make it more relevant to 21st century trade. I think this is a very hard issue, even for the G20, but I think if we have the G20, we should also have this hard issue also in the agenda. That's what I say for the moment. Thank you.
We are on this side, so you have the floor. But we are running out of time.
Thank you.
And Yusuf Bey, that's the end.
Nagesh
So we have three
Kumar
more
from
questions.
UNSCAP. Very briefly, I think some of the questions or comments I had in mind were answered. One thing I like to say that if WTO is not going to be based on consensus and go in more and more plurilateral direction, how would it be different from RTAs? And I think that would weaken it. The multilateral part would be weakened. But I like this idea that Professor Baldwin was proposing, that opening up dispute settlement system of WTO to bilateral and regional trading arrangements could be a very good glue to bring these RTAs and bilateral FTAs together with the multilateralism, and there could be synergies over time being explored. And I think we seriously need to consider the multilateral investment agreement. There was a time when, I mean, there are a lot of people and developing countries were opposing that, but over time, the kind of backlash there is against bilaterals, maybe I think with that experience in hindsight, it may be worthwhile to consider a multilateral investment agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman over here. And Yusuf Bey, that will be the end. Sorry. We have closed the speaking list.
I have a question for Gary Hofbauer, which is related to the point Richard just made. If we are going from goods crossing borders to factories crossing borders, and if we are going to have high-tech moving to low-wage countries, there's a greater degree of asymmetry in bargaining power between advanced economies that have high technology and low-wage countries, unless the low-wage countries are like China and have a huge market and pit advanced economies against each other. So an advanced economy by itself or working with other advanced economies have an incentive to have sort of an asymmetrical trade agreement rather than relying on multilateral trade regime. And the grand bargain you suggested, Gary, seems to me has an upside and downside for the United States. The upside is that the United States could now override a single country veto, like the India in trade facilitation agreement. But the downside is as Richard pointed out, if the United States cannot form a veto coalition, then double-weighted consensus rule could actually be opposed to the interest of the United States. And maybe we need to have, Security Council like a structure to have a veto and so on. But then the question then becomes who gets into the Security Council and what would be the voting quotas and so on. So could you give me more detail on the grand bargain that you propose as far as the mechanism?
Gentleman, Yusuf Bey, and that will be the end.
Yusuf Işık, economist. My question is primarily addressed to Mr. Richard Baldwin, but also to other panelists, if they wish to respond, because he spoke so articulately about the 21st century structure of the economy and technology. I think that intellectual property rights, they receive less attention proportionately to their importance. I think their importance is likely to rise enormously. And of course, it's a delicate matter, but in T20, perhaps we are also supposed to deal with vanguard issues. And I would like to know what, in their eyes, are prospects for coming to an agreement or an arrangement or a way of dealing with this issue. And secondly, as you remember, the issue of cultural goods had led to a backlash years ago in the investment agreement effort. And this remains a very sensitive issue, even in TTIP, I think. So I would be glad if you could also put your views on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the end of the questions. Now it is up to the panel if they want to respond. I'm sure they want.
I will pick up just a few of the questions and leave a great many on the table. First, the exchange rate issue, right, it should not be forgotten. Again, I think that's conceivable. It could be a subject of a plurilateral agreement within the WTO. I think it's a remote possibility, but it would be a possibility and not more than that. Now, on the plurilaterals, and I want to now turn to the last question which was asked to me, it's not binding on any member that doesn't belong. So Richard's concern that the U.S. might be overridden, well, indeed, there might be a plurilateral agreement that the U.S. didn't belong to. The terms of that agreement would not bind the United States. They would bind the members of the agreement. And from my standpoint, I don't think the U.S. should have a veto in, in the WTO the way it has in the UN or whatever. So that doesn't bother me that that the U.S. no longer has the dominant position that Richard assigned to it in the past. So that to me is not such a problematic issue, though I'm sure for other people it might be. Let me just pick up one more question about the trade growth being slower than GDP growth, and observed convergence. We have observed tremendous convergence. Look what's happened in China. In the lifetime of everybody in this room, anybody over 20 years old, this is just amazing what has happened, or 30 years old, since Deng took power in 1979. I mean, this country has just done amazingly well by integrating with the world economy, brought 500 million people at least. Maybe there's some couple hundred who are not participating, but several hundred million are participating. It's the most dramatic convergence that we've probably seen in modern history. So you do get convergence, but China bought on. China is the most capitalistic country in the world today. I mean, it bought on to everything, basically. So it can happen, but if a country doesn't want to buy onto the model, well, it may very well not converge. If I could just make one final point, why is trade growth slower than GDP growth? That issue came up in the chairman's initial remarks. My reason is that policy liberalization stopped with the Marrakesh Agreement, and that's 20 years ago, and all that has been phased in. The reason trade growth was so much faster than GDP growth and was such an engine for 50 years was that we had wave after wave of liberalization, in my view, and both unilateral, plurilateral, multilateral. It was just great. But in the last 20 years, it's been pretty slow. Maybe it's starting again now, but that's my big explanation.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me just pick up two of the points. First of all, the question as to why this 21st century trade hasn't benefited everybody. So if you think about the model of factories crossing borders, this is not like everybody lowering tariff and each country goes to its comparative advantage. It changes comparative advantage. You take German technology, combine it with Polish wages, and you have a different world. If you take US and Japanese technology and combine it with Chinese labors and institutions, you have a completely different world. But only where the companies go. What you have is technology moving within firm boundaries, but across country boundaries, but not everywhere. Only where the GVCs go. That's the first point. It is not a general trade where all rich countries get poor and all poor countries get richer because everything's diffusing across borders better. It's mitigated within firm boundaries. The second thing is because China's doing it the new way, with high tech and low wages, they've ruined the game for everybody trying to do it the old way. So if you're trying to make manufactured goods with Brazilian technology and Brazilian wages, which used to compensate for each other, and you're trying to compete with China, who's doing it with Japanese technology and Chinese wages, you can't compete. So in fact, what I like to say is GVCs killed import substitution and actively, through the terms of trade effect, deindustrialized many countries who are not doing it the new way. That's my explanation. On the inequality that Malcolm brought up, so it's the flip side of that. So in the old days, you can think about Team Germany. And there was German technology and German wages, and there was some tension between them, but basically everybody was on the same side. If you had good German technology, it meant eventually good German wages. But now, when the German firms can take the know-how elsewhere, the team is undone to a certain extent. And it is, at least to a certain extent, the certitudes of allowing freer movement of trade do not apply necessarily to freer movement of technology. Now, it's hard to know what would look like, and so where are you going with that? Would you stop offshoring or what? It's not clear what the counterfactual is, but it's a different deal when German technology, subsidized by German R&D subsidies, is being used to create jobs in another country. Just a different world. Now, the actual percentage, I'm not sure. I mean, the US middle class or workers, they're competing with robots at home and China abroad. And it's not going well for them. But how much is robots and how much is China, I think it's almost impossible to say. And in many ways, it's a counterfactual which isn't particularly useful. So let's suppose we said it was 20%, but that 20% coming from trade was driven by the changes in technology, which is also hurting them, in particular ICT, automation, all these things which are encouraging offshoring and breaking up the production structure internationally are also hurting the workers at home. So I don't think it's a correct intellectual exercise to say this much is from trade, this much from technology, because they're all affecting each other. But the outcome of it is very clear that it's just in a different world.
You don't? Would you? You don't have to.
Well, I just pass that. Okay. Just a couple of words on SMEs and what we were talking about. One is that when we talk what I mentioned about participating in global value chains by an SMEs, I mean a local SME, not FDI. So there are two things. One is to understand what is required of an SME by the value chain, and then to implement whatever that is applied. So understanding is the first thing, which is not always there. And then to implement, you have to have two things. One is technology, which has to be either bought or acquired somehow, which is not easy. And then comes the investment issue, which you're right. And I do agree there may be a global facility, but I don't think it is realistic these days to ask for any other global facility. So that's why I say that maybe the G20 may ask or may induce the existing development banks to go into this type of activity. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think this brings us. You would like to say something? Sorry.
I just add
I thought you
other question. Actually, if you have some free time, try to compare Korea-EU FTA and Singapore-EU FTA. Actually, you can find the two FTAs very similar. And also try to compare Korea-US FTA and Singapore-US FTA. It looks completely similar. What does it mean? Actually, small and less developed countries are supposed to follow template provided by large developed country. Actually, it's kind of trade-off between market access and a kind of regulatory reform, or just they follow up the template of developed country. So in that sense, probably it's a northern country who impose their model to southern country, but there is much room for developing country to take this opportunity in favor of their development agenda. That's a conclusion as a trade economist.
Well, thank you. Although I mean, I think that was and came to that's a very important subject, the investment and the new generation of trade agreements, FTAs, do carry an investment section which is more substantial than the bilateral investment treaties. So it is good. Well, thank you so much. It was a wonderful meeting, I suppose, and we should get a big round of applause for the panelists.